Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Our guest is Bud Jericho, who is the co-founder and CEO of Indigo Technologies. We also have Brett Anderson, who's our project manager for OSENT and truly the backbone of all of the heavy lifting. Buddy's going to talk today about the synergy between generative AI and online investigations. I'm going to let Buddy and Brett introduce themselves, and then we're just going to go in and talk about everything and anything. So, Buddy, do you want to give us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, first, I just want to say thank you, Cynthia, for having me on the show, and Brett for facilitating. As we were talking before we jumped into the actual podcast, this is a pretty exciting year. So what an awesome way to kick it off with OSMOSIS launching their institute and Indago launching their company. So I think these things were meant to be. So I'm pretty excited. Just a little bit about me. I spent some time in the Army, just under 10 years. And then I spent 10 more years in the intelligence community. And I've done some defense contracting off and on. But really, my experience is I started out as a human intelligence guy. And then in 2012, I transitioned into the open source intelligence space, which, something people have been doing for a very long time, researching publicly available data. But, we really put a name on it in 2012. And so I started a company in that space when I resigned from the government, sold that company a few years ago. And now I'm on to my next venture, which is Dogo Technologies. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get further into the podcast.
Great. And Brett, you want to give a little bit of background on you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming out, buddy, and thank you for having us, Cynthia. This is our first ever OSMOSIS podcast, so I appreciate everyone working to put this thing together. Just like Buddy, I'm a former Army guy for the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps. I was there for 20 years. I started out as a geospatial intelligence non-commissioned officer and finished out as a open source or all source non-commissioned officer. After that, I went to the commercial sector and started doing open source intelligence with Buddy on previous jobs where I got to learn how to do intelligence for companies. And it's a totally different light than the way you do it in the Department of Defense. And I just got this passion in me to start learning and understanding more and more about open source intelligence. And that brought me to OSMOSIS, the Association for OSINT Professionals. So we're going to attempt here to get the questions out there that our researchers and our online investigators want to hear. So with that, we're talking about generative AI today with Bud Jericho, and there's one question that rises to the top of the surface anytime you bring up generative AI with open source investigations, and that is security. What's the security behind this generative AI platforms that we're talking about? As an investigator, what do I need to know if I'm going to use one? Are there some switches I can turn off? Just tell us how you're using it.
Yeah, Brett, that's a great question to start off with. And I just to kind of put it in perspective, when we think about generative AI, the story of the development of generative AI, I think is important to keep in perspective. So, if you think about like music, we went from a long time ago, we had to listen to the radio and we hoped that, our favorite song came on the radio. And then a thing called records and cassette tapes came out. And it was pretty cool because now we could fast forward to songs on a cassette tape. But you didn't know exactly where the song was. Some of us, I think you probably remember, you marked the cassette tape based on how thick that roll was, so you knew where to go. But that was evolutionary. And then we got these things called CDs where you could click a button and jump ahead 3-4 songs. And that was incredible. And then you had Steve Jobs get on stage and tell the world that he had 1,000 songs in his pocket, and it blew our minds. And now the way we engage our music is we just tell Alexa to play whatever it is we want them to play at any given time. And so I tell that story because artificial intelligence, the parallel and application of artificial intelligence in music is very similar to our trade. And so for us as investigators and professional intelligence folks, we started out a long time ago, Cynthia, I'm sure remembers this, going to libraries and looking up data. And then, in the research space, our Steve Jobs with an iPod in his pocket moment was Google search, right? When Google search came out, we're like, this is incredible. We can search all this data on the internet. It's going to be a game changer. It's huge. And that really changed the way we thought. And so when we do things like Google search, we're entering data into the URL and we're exposing Google to all of our searches, right? Now, there are a few things that we've taught classes on this, right? Where you could do it anonymously. You could you set up a different account to access Google. But the reality of it is Google was getting access to everything you did on that platform, as is the other platforms as well. And so in the intelligence space, in the research space, our big moment, like from being able to request a song on Alexa at any given time of any genre, well, that's how impactful generative AI now is to the research space, right? It's conversational. So with Google, we searched for data. With generative AI, we converse about the data, we interrogate the data. And so from a security perspective, it's not really much different than what we've done in the past. So I'll take OpenAI into account. And please keep in mind, there's different levels of security, right? Just like when you're doing open source intelligence. There's security that you can control inside of a platform like OpenAI. For instance, you can share links to the GPT you're building. You can share the entire GPT to the public. If you've seen recently, OpenAI has created a store where you can actually monetize the GPTs you're developing. So obviously, if you're sharing those, you're sharing data. Or you can create a GPT and have no links and have it not shared. And so that's the ability of people on the platform to see your data and your prompts. So that's one level of security. The other level of security is as we connect platforms to large language models like OpenAI, like Bard, well, in connecting those APIs, there are inherent security risks. But that's not necessarily on the language model. That's on the security of the API connections that you're using, right? There are some companies like Nightfall.ai that now provide services where they can put those APIs in a wrapper, almost like a VPN, to protect the data transmission. So those are two. And then the third piece of the security question that we have to take into account is how the language models themselves are secured. And so if anybody's been following OpenAI, they did a developers day in November. And in that developers day, they really announced their push to get more secure because a lot of big companies were worried about the data that you submit to the language model, that data would go back to the language model, train the language model, and potentially be made available to other people. Well, OpenAI has said they've changed that dramatically. And so I think as of today, OpenAI's GPT-4 is SOC 2 compliant. I don't think it's HIPAA yet, but it is DPRA compliant as well. And so I think as these models mature, they'll be more secure. And so, but I think the fine tip to put on that is, and as we go through this conversation, I am more optimistic about technology, not pessimistic. And what I mean by that is, I'd much rather be optimistic and wrong than pessimistic and right. And I think as we think about generative AI, people are looking for reasons. A lot of people I talk to are looking for reasons why not to use this technology, where in fact, the levels of security that have to be applied here are the same levels of security that have had to be applied in the past when we conduct things like open source intelligence.
Well, that's awesome. So basically, us online investigators need to do our investigations and educate ourselves before making our hasty decisions. You did say that the security measures are moving with progression of technology. So is it accurate to assume that I should stay away from some of the older ones like ChatGPT 3 or 3.5 and just try to stay on the newer versions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think, well, one, I don't know the answer to that question explicitly. I do know that the language models, the frameworks with which they're housed on, they are becoming more secure. So my assumption would be that those new security protocols apply to all the different models that exist. But I can't tell you that explicitly because I haven't really done a bunch of research there. But it only makes sense that would be the case, I think. But I would definitely double check that for sure.
All right, awesome. I appreciate it. So now that I've got my language model secured, what do I do with this thing? What's my workflow? How do I phrase my questions? How do I wrap my critical thinking around this thing that is probably smarter than me and knows more than me? How do I integrate with it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brett. And it's something I've been talking to folks about a lot lately. So to start off this conversation, I think it's important for people to understand something called the employee marginal productivity. And especially in the PI space, I've run into this quite a bit speaking at some of the PI conferences. And so employee marginal productivity, essentially what that means is that that's how you essentially determine how much to pay an employee based on their level of productivity. Okay. Why do I say that? I say that because as we move forward, what we're finding, and there have been several studies on this so far, that employees that embrace AI, things like generative AI, are becoming much more productive than employees that don't leverage this type of technology. And so the question really is either you embrace this sooner rather than later and elevate your productivity and either make your company more money or be a more productive and efficient analyst, or you don't embrace it and that employee marginal productivity sinks. Now, businesses are essentially going to be forced at some point, if they want to stay competitive, to hire people that are skilled and have the skill set of leveraging generative AI. It just makes sense, right? I mean, we see it all the time now. I'm sure folks that are listening that have used generative AI to write a policy or to write an SOP or to do training material. How much faster does generative AI do that than if you would have started from scratch, like we used to do, back in the old days? And I say the old days, we're talking 5 years ago. And so now that your language model is secure and you're using it, I wanted to point that out because I think that's the mindset people need to have is, how do you learn this technology, embrace it, and start leveraging it? Because it's not going anywhere. If not anything, it's evolving. And so oh, sorry, go ahead, Brett.
Hi, this is Cynthia. I wanted to know, when you're talking about embracing it and talking with it and doing your prompts, you're actually having a conversation, because when you want something to come back, if you're writing up the report or writing an email and you want it to go in, you can go in and say, I want it to be a night, this is a sensitive subject. I'm writing it for a response to XYZ, and you'll get a response like that, or you can change that tone back and forth, which is awesome. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's not picking up on sensitivity, but you do need to understand those prompts, right?
Yeah, so this is an interesting part of generative AI, whereas just a few months ago, you had to really write good prompts to get good data, right? So if you didn't write a good question, you didn't get a good answer. And the way I explain this to folks in the Intel space is, it's like conducting an interrogation of a detainee, or for a PI, it's like interviewing a subject. If I ask that subject open-ended questions, I'm going to get vague answers, extremely vague answers, right? But if I ask very, very specific questions, I'm going to get very specific answers. And so early on with generative AI, and I say early on, I'm talking just a few months ago, everybody was concerned with hallucinations. I looked at hallucinations, I think, a little bit differently than some people. I looked at hallucinations as insight into how the model actually works, as opposed to just saying, hey, the model doesn't work. But the more specific the prompt, the more specific the question, the better the result. And the more questions you ask in a prompt, the more specific you get as a result. But here's the thing, that is already changing. That's how quickly this technology is evolving. So if you go into OpenAI now or ChatGPT and you buy the premium version and you build, your own GPT, you don't even have to write the prompts anymore. Essentially, you converse with the GPT, and as you're having that conversation, ChatGPT in the background is creating the prompts on your behalf. So even the idea of writing prompts, which was a big deal a few months ago, even that has drastically evolved and is changing very quickly. But for training, when we train folks on how to use ChatGPT or any other language model, we focus really on 7 different prompt techniques. And I talk about this a lot in an ebook that we released a few months ago, that we're actually going to be releasing a new update because of this evolution of prompting in the past few months. But there are really 7 areas, 7 different prompt techniques that we focus on. One is conversational flow. And you kind of touched on that, Cynthia. And that's just conversing back and forth with the language model to arrive at a question or an answer that you're looking for, or an idea. And I should caveat it with, even GPT-4 is not perfect by any means. I wouldn't just rely on that for answers, but it is certainly good at creating ideas, generating ideas, and providing good start points. The second technique is reverse prompting. There's also multi-step prompts, incremental instructions, where you essentially provide the language model instructions as you go so that you can back it into a space where it starts to answer very specific questions. And doing that incremental prompting essentially means that you learn along the way how much the language model actually, or how beneficial the language model can actually be in an area. So if you're going into an area where you start getting a lot of vague responses, which a lot of people have seen, well, then you kind of rework those prompts and move into another direction or attack the research question from another angle. The second is memory recall. As most people know that particularly in ChatGPT or Poe, the more you have a conversation in a single chat, the more intelligent or the more capable the language model becomes at answering your questions. Now, one of the features I'd love to see that doesn't exist yet, at least that I've found, is the ability to cross chats. So if I start a chat on one topic and then I start a chat on another topic, my understanding at the moment is those chats can't cross-communicate or cross-pollinate. So I always tell people when you're building those chats or those GPTs, one GPT or one chat for each subject, and then continue to use that, because the more you use it, the more you can leverage that memory call technique. And then the other is narrative expansion. And that's just when you hit a dead end or when you're kind of going through your prompt techniques and you get to a point where you run out of ideas, you can actually ask the GPT to give you some ideas on other questions that you might want to ask the GPT to continue down that pathway of finding information or conducting research. And so those are just some of the prompt techniques that we follow at Indago and that we've been teaching folks. But I think as the technology evolves, prompts will become less important and longer conversations and adding more knowledge to the chat will become much more important.
So it sounds to me it's along the same critical thinking path as what I use to build my Google Docs. If I just throw a bunch of words into a Google search string, I'm going to get 500,000 results, but I have to start painting Google in a corner with some quotation marks and a file type colon and an insight colon, so I can start painting those results down to a corner. So it sounds like it's the same critical thinking style as what I've always used for my research. I just get to do it conversationally now with a machine engine on the backside.
Yeah,
so
Brett, I think about it the same way. That's right.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier is hallucinations. As an analyst, how can I confirm my results coming out of AI? Is there a way I can bounce it off another AI and see what results it gives me, or just try a different prompt, or how would I confirm what I'm getting back?
Well, the easiest way to do it is when you ask a large language model a question, in your prompt or in your question, just tell it to provide all the sources, cite the sources that it leveraged for that question, and it'll do that for you. So that's one way to do it. The other thing about hallucinations I think is important for people to understand is, and a lot of people, I mean, pretty much everybody has seen, like with Outlook, about a year ago in Outlook, when you were typing your sentence, you saw like it would start finishing your sentence, and if you hit tab, it completed it. Well, frankly, these language models are very, very similar, just at a much larger scale. And so the hallucinations in a language model isn't because it's intentionally giving you wrong information. What it's doing is it's giving you the next logical word in a sequence of words that align with your request. So sometimes those hallucinations are just it doing its best to anticipate what you want it to tell you. And so that's why I think it's important, one, to ask for citations, but two, to ask the same question a few different ways when using the language model and see how those answers change. Now, to your point about should I use another AI, it is important, I think, for people that are leveraging generative AI to understand that language models they're not all the same, right? They're very different. It's kind of like web browsers when you're conducting open source intelligence. They're not all the same. So for instance, like if I want like a narrative answer, or I'm writing a book, or I'm looking to help myself do, social media posts, ChatGPT is very, very good at that. But if I'm looking at like statistical data and I want to do analysis and math and so forth, Bard is a lot more capable in that regards. And so these language models all have different strengths, and those are based on the amount of transponders and the data sets that each of those models access. And so It's not a one for one when you're looking at different language models. They all have their different strengths and weaknesses. So I'd strongly suggest that that somebody do their research on what the strengths and weaknesses are for each of those models, and then align whatever it is you're doing, that research, that work, with the language model that is best aligned with what you're trying to accomplish.
Fantastic. I appreciate it. So now that I've understood my security, I've understood how to work with my generative AI engine. Where do I go to put it? What's the adoption rate out there for companies that are using this stuff? I understand you probably have a company yourself that's using this to help analysts do their jobs. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there was an interesting study done recently by McKinsey, and it's I am very transparent in the fact that I use generative AI as much as I possibly can. Right, I don't, there are some things I am good at, and there's more things I am not good at than good at. Let's just put it that way. And so if there's an area where generative AI can make me better and more productive, I'm using it. And I say that because McKinsey recently did a study and the study looked into the adoption of generative AI across the board. What they found out as part of this study is when they asked people openly in a forum if they use generative AI, most people said no. But when they asked privately, a majority of the people said yes. And I think the reason for that is I think people think of generative AI right now as cheating, right? And so they don't want anybody to know the gig's up. But there's also these memes floating around the internet, like if ChatGPT goes down, the world's going to stop because everybody's become so reliant on it. And so the adoption rate is very high. It's evolving and it's happening quickly. But I liken it to the invention of the calculator, right? I'm sure that when the calculator first came out, people said that's cheating. But nowadays, almost nobody does any math longer than plus and times and minuses without using a calculator. So I look at sort of generative AI the same, but the adoption rate is very high. There's actually in some companies I've read recently that they're actually adding a chief AI officer to the executive staffs of several Fortune 50 businesses because of the massive adoption rate and how much more efficient it's making people. And the last thing I'll say to that, one of the more interesting ideas I've heard recently was that a CEO colleague of mine, he decided that every single executive member of his team had to create a GPT that mimicked their position. And so he said before the employees go to him or the leadership team goes to him, they have to converse first with the GPT to flesh out their ideas and ensure they're thinking about it from as many different perspectives as possible before bringing it to the board. And I thought that was just a pretty smart way to use this technology, because when you think about the cost of an employee sitting in a boardroom or sitting in an executive room with 10 people who you're paying a lot of money to talk through a topic, that could get pretty expensive for a business. But if you're able to do all your homework with the GPT before you bring it to that meeting, it could be a significant savings in money and time for employees, for companies.
I agree on that one. It's really like an encyclopedia. You're going there for the words, you're going for the language, trying to make sure that particular word is meaning what you're trying to get across. And really, ChatGPT is just making it so much faster than having to go through the pages.
Yeah, and I'm waiting to find some of the pitfalls too, because I'm not naming any names, but I might have known people to write legal agreements between companies using a ChatGPT, and I'm curious to see when we hit a pothole on we've used it too much, and there really should still be a person in the middle to review things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Brett, I think that's the big pitfall that you just hit on. And I've seen this where I now get emails from people sometimes, or responses, or even on social media. And you become so accustomed to what these language models produce now that that some people are just cutting and pasting exactly what the model says. And I think that's the big pitfall is relying solely on what the output is of that language model to share information with people. And I know we're not going to get into it in this conversation. Hopefully we do it in another, in another podcast, but that's where we really run the risk of significantly enhancing the disruption of things like mis and disinformation across society.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate the time today, buddy. We've for our first initial podcast for Osmosis Association, I think we covered a lot of ground on generative AI and how to secure my platform, how to work with it. And basically, the moral of the story is embrace it quick, fast, and in a hurry, and learn from it, and prove that it's wrong. Prove where the pitfalls are, so that the geniuses behind it can make it better. So moving forward for Osmosis, we're obviously going to be posting this on our site, and I believe we've got a capture the flag exercise to look forward to from you sometime next week, right?
That's right, Brett.
Absolutely. So make sure everyone tunes in to Osmosis website next week for the capture the flag. It'll be an AI based exercise for us to test our skills with and see how well we prompt. And then, buddy, what is Indago got in the future?
Yeah, so we've been working hard this past year building this technology, and it's actually pretty simple what the tech does. What we wanted to do is set out to build a piece of technology that enabled people to create and generate reports faster, and that's it. The two things we identified in our market research was, one, it takes way more time than it needs to for an analyst to generate a report nowadays. And, especially because of all the data they're exposed to. And then secondly, report writing, I think because of the advancement of technology and the advancement of, and the increase in access to data, the people that we surveyed and talked to, we found out that report writing quality has actually significantly decreased over the past few years as well. And so that's really what we set out to do, build a platform that generates reports faster while increasing the quality of those reports. There's an old adage in the government, Brett, you probably remember this: if it's not reported, it never happened. And I would take that a step further. If it's reported and it's written very badly, it might as well never happen, because nobody's going to read your report, right? And so that's what we're doing with Indago. It's a very simple user interface. It leverages generative artificial intelligence. It's a secure platform, yeah, and our goal is, right now, what we understand is it takes the average analyst about 6 to 8 hours to generate a quality report. We believe that with our technology that we can get that down to under 30 minutes. And so you can imagine the cost savings, the time savings for businesses and the government with the technology like that. And probably most important to me is, one of the ways that I think we combat disinformation is allowing policymakers and decision makers and commanders to get the decisions faster. And so that's one of my passions with this technology, is if we can help people, get a research question, get to an answer, get it to a decision maker in a rapid fashion, then, that's less time that our adversaries have to take advantage of narratives and disrupt our society here in America. Or, because the deal, we've heard this a lot in the Middle East, if you tell a lie long enough, it becomes the truth. And that's the problem with disinformation. And so the faster we can gather facts, the faster we can make decisions, the less of an opportunity our adversaries have to disrupt the information environment.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. And Indago does provide some training for people on their prompts, correct?
Yeah, that's right, Brett. We wrote an ebook. We're actually updating that right now. We're going to be releasing the new ebook in a couple of weeks. And then we put together an introduction to generative AI course. And the reason we did that is, after speaking at several conferences, I realized in sidebar conversations is people are really just struggling to get their head wrapped around what this thing is, what it does for them. And so we put that class together as really a basic introductory course. We talk about the different models, transformers, how generative AI works, the evolution of generative AI. We provide some use cases. But that course, when we launch our software in a few weeks, that course will be included in the software subscription. And we plan to continue to build more courses, but those courses will be available as part of the software, not separately.
Awesome. I look forward to taking one myself. Well, to our listeners out there, we've got a great partnership in the Osmosis Association here with entrepreneurs like Bud Jericho, who's pioneering the realm of AI and online investigations for us. And we're going to bring him back and hopefully get a sneak peek at his platform later on in the month when it launches. So really looking forward to that one. And Buddy, I appreciate your time today. I appreciate the insights on everything, and I look forward to working with you more. You got any closing remarks?
No, just thank you, Brett, for your time. Thank you, Cynthia, as well. I'm excited about this partnership. I I'm just excited to see where things go this year for all of us. And thank you for letting me be your first guest. I'm honored, truly honored.
We're excited,
Yeah.
two people going strong. And one thing is, how can we get a hold of you if the listeners want to reach out to you? If they want to just send an email as opposed to going through our platform, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, the easiest way to get a hold of me is probably on LinkedIn. Just search on LinkedIn for Bud Jericho. Or if you want to reach out to me via email, it's B Jericho, Jericho, at indagotechnologies.com. And it's Indago, Indago, as opposed to Indigo, Indigo. So it's Indago Technologies.
And where does Indago come from, buddy?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So our logo for the company, it's actually an African wild dog. And you'll notice we call him Rufus internally. That's not going to be our name to the world, but we call him Rufus. And the reason we chose an African wild dog is they actually have the highest kill rate as predators. And so what we're creating on our platform is essentially the ability for people to hunt and research information faster and more efficiently. And so we felt that the African wild dog was a perfect logo for us. And Indago in Latin is research and hunt.
Perfect.
So that's where it came from.
And with that kill sign in there, you've got Indago doing your report and killing it.
That's right. That's exactly it. Exactly. So the last thing I'd say is, folks, as you think about generative AI and you think about how to leverage it, I would just caution you to err on the side of optimism as opposed to pessimism, because you don't want to be, it's a famous podcaster once said, I won't say any names. He said, if you didn't adopt cloud technology 10 years ago, your company probably doesn't exist right now. And if you're not adopting and learning generative AI today, you probably won't have a job in a couple of years, unless you're in a space that doesn't require technology, which I don't think there's many of those today. But, and so stay optimistic about this stuff. Bet on optimism. Don't plan for pessimism. Plan with pessimism.
Well, thank you. And this is Cynthia Navarro, Brett Anderson from Osmosis, host and Buddy Jericho of Indago. We appreciate everyone's time today.
Thank you.